Might not be as noticeable because the clitoris is smaller, all right? But it would still happen, could still happen.
So a man can still have ejaculation, but he won't be able to feel. He can still have an orgasm. Like
That's part of the orgasm. Now he wouldn't feel the pleasure of it, okay? But the orgasm is a series of physiological events culminating in the ejaculation,
so,
part of the ejaculation.
So, you know, if you have an orgasm, you don't just feel it in one place, it kind of goes over your whole body. So you wouldn't feel it like above the T10.
Right. No, if it's above, any flushing changes, skin color changes below that level would occur, but not above, and you wouldn't feel those components. Okay. All right, so that is one event that we just covered.
Correct.
Erection. Okay, and that's a parasympathetic controlled event. Okay. So now let's look at emission. Same source of stimulation. Okay, the sensory neuron along the shaft of the penis and the glans penis is going to, I'm going to erase the parasympathetic just so it doesn't confuse events. Get too much on there. All right, so the sensory, and this is, I drew it on one side, but it would happen on both sides. Okay, so we'd have sensory stimuli on both sides coming in. And how is it, do we have any sympathetic neurons at the sacral level? No. Sacral stops at lumbar. Okay, so the second lumbar vertebra is the lowest we go down for sympathetic level. So we're going to have to get to our sympathetic neurons up here by sending our sensory neurons up as they're on their way to the brain. Some of them will stop off at the lumbar levels. And there we'll have the same kind of reflex activity. This time, the motor neuron is in our lateral gray horn, and it's a sympathetic preganglionic neuron. It will come out the ventral root. And it will come into the postganglionic neuron, not the postganglionic, the sympathetic ganglion. Now we're going to follow it down into the pelvis. It could take the lumbar splanchnic route, but we're just going to try to do a little simpler here. And it's going to come down here and not synapse and come out another splanchnic nerve. Into that rat's nest. Into this plexus. Okay? And there it will synapse. It doesn't go into the organs to synapse. So, I'll make it a little shorter here so I have some room. And remember what structures are affected by emission? What structures are affected by emission? Emission is the movement of sperm up the vas deferens and the secretion of seminal vesicle and prostate gland and vulvourethral glands. Okay? So, sympathetic neurons are going to go to the vas deferens and to the prostate gland and to the seminal vesicle. So, we'll just draw one structure here. And that's all of those. So this is emission effectors, meaning muscle of the vas deferens. Can't read it. Emission effector. So muscle of the vas deferens and our glands. And we will see postganglionic neurons releasing norepinephrine onto those structures. All right. Now, let's say that our motorcycle accident damaged his L1, L2. That's where the transection occurred. It was right at L1 and L2. Would he be able to have an erection? Yeah. Yes. Would he be able to ejaculate any fluid? No. Because he won't be able to. He'll still produce the sperm, all right? But he wouldn't be able to innervate the smooth muscle of the vas deferens to get the sperm propelled up into the urethra. Okay? So the difference here, same sensory stimulation, it's ongoing, okay? But now we have to activate the sympathetic neurons at a higher level. And so we use those sensory neurons that are on their way up to the brain, and some of them will stop at the lumbar level to activate the sympathetic neurons. So our sympathetic pre- and postganglionic neurons are going to activate these vas deferens structures. And so this neuron, or these series of neurons, this is our pelvic splanchnic, okay? These are carrying preganglionic neurons, and they are sympathetic. So these are called sacral splanchnic. And again, it helps to remember because sacral starts with an S for sympathetic. Well, it's really S for sacral, but it matches up with sympathetic. All right, if we look at that other diagram, those are these fibers right here. So preganglionic neurons are coming down the sympathetic chain after being activated by the sensory reflex and the spinal cord. And they will exit the sympathetic chain, come into the rat synapse with their postganglionic neuron, and then those fibers will go, again this is female, those fibers will go to the vas deferens and the seminal vesicle and the prostate gland. So when you see it coming off the sympathetic chain and going into the rat's nest, these are the sacral splanchnics. These are the pelvic splanchnics. Okay. All right, so what's the neurotransmitter of our sympathetic neurons for postganglionic? Norepinephrine. Okay. And norepinephrine binds to beta-1 receptors for excitation. So beta-1 and alpha-1, but alpha is usually blood vessels. So we're going to look at norepinephrine results. Now, let's say that, back to our poor guy with the transected spinal cord at C10. Okay. And norepinephrine is released as a result of sympathetic stimuli. Would his heart rate increase? Would his blood pressure go up? That's above the level of the transected spinal cord. What other organ is going to release norepinephrine and epinephrine into the bloodstream when the sympathetic nervous system is activated? Adrenal gland. Okay, so that part would still happen. All right, so you might see cardiac effects, even though that's above the level of the transection. Acetylcholine doesn't get into the bloodstream. There's no other organ that releases acetylcholine as a hormone. So we wouldn't see that side effect, but we could still see the norepinephrine. So, emission. Okay? Now, what do we have left? Ejaculation. 3 different types of neurons function in ejaculation. So look back at the pathway that I erased that was parasympathetic. All right? That's the pathway that parasympathetic fibers will use, except the postganglionic neuron is going to be where? It's going to be activating. Preganglionic neuron is going to go to the bladder. Sorry again. Preganglionic neuron is going to go to the urethra and cause peristalsis. The postganglionic neuron will innervate smooth muscle of the urethra. And so the parasympathetic response in ejaculation is peristalsis and milking of the sperm through the urethra. So that previous pathway that we showed is still the same pathway. It's just the pelvic splanchnic neurons, instead of going to the penis. Other additional, those will still be going there because we still have an erection, okay? Or the guys that do. Additional preganglionic neurons will go to the urethra, and postganglionic neurons will release acetylcholine, causing urethral muscle undergoing peristaltic to milk the sperm down through the urethra for ejaculation. Okay? Parasympathetic component of ejaculation. What was the sympathetic component? The constriction of the urethral sphincter, the involuntary urethral sphincter. So, these sacral splanchnic neurons will also have additional neurons going to the sphincter of the bladder, causing it to constrict. So that's the role of sympathetic neurons in ejaculation. What was the third type? Voluntary. What are the voluntary muscles associated with erectile tissue? Tissue cavernosus and bulbospongiosis. All right? So those neurons come from the anterior, whoops, I don't want to do it with that one. Come from the anterior gray horn. Are they autonomic? Nope, because they're going to skeletal muscle. This is still working. I'm just removing it so it's not quite as. You guys can take pictures of it if you have. Okay, so sensory pathway is still the same, but now our sensory neurons are forming a motor reflex, a voluntary motor reflex. Where do we find lower motor neurons? What part of the spinal cord do we find voluntary lower motor neurons? Front or back? Anterior gray horn or posterior gray horn? Anterior. All right. So these are going to form a synapse with anterior lower motor neurons in the anterior gray horn. They will come out the ventral root as well. They're not going to go into any of the splanchnics. They will come off of our ventral rami, forming the pudendal nerve. And I'll show you on here what the pudendal nerve is. So on both sides, voluntary motor neurons come via the pudendal nerve. You can see it here, right here, but I'll show it to you in a little clearer picture, and we also have it on our models. So, remember I said the ventral rami come together and form the sciatic nerve? Earlier, coming off of that, we have a few bundles of neurons that form the pudendal nerve. Instead of going out the back and down the leg, it comes forward and goes to the perineal area. So here are all these ventral rami coming out the greater sciatic notch as the sciatic nerve. See the greater sciatic notch here? Okay, so that's the sciatic nerve. When all that happens, the pudendal nerve comes off of that as a smaller bundle. It comes out the sciatic nerve, out the greater sciatic notch, over the ischial spine, and comes back into the perineum via the lesser sciatic notch. Remember studying about that in 430? And that's the nerve that provides motor innervation. So here's the greater sciatic notch. Here's the ischial spine. Here's the lesser sciatic notch. Here's the sciatic nerve. Here's the pudendal nerve. Traveling towards, it's going to innervate our external anal sphincter. It's going to innervate all the structures in the perineum. Okay? Forming smaller branches called perineal nerve, but we're not going to go that far. Now it's flipped around. Here's the pudendal nerve, here, coming forward and sending branches to the bulbospongiosus muscle and branches to the skin of the penis, not the blood supply, branches to the urethral sphincter. So that's the way in which voluntary neurons get to those muscles. You can actually see that nerve as it travels here in our skeletal muscle. I got there already. That nerve, right. So this is the view of that previous slide. Here is the pudendal nerve. And up here it's forming the perineal branches to those muscles. But right there is pudendal. Okay? So, kind of in this gap. So I'll just pass this around. It's right in there. Okay? That's the pudendal nerve. And that's how we then add the voluntary function of ejaculation. Because this is voluntary, it will function in addition to the reflex. So they'll start to contract with orgasm, okay? But you can increase them as well. So both male and female can make orgasm more intense by focusing on contracting, or start orgasm for females by focus on contracting those muscles because they're voluntary. They can use conscious thought. Once the orgasm reflex starts, you're not going to say, oh, well, forget it, I've stopped that, okay, because the rest of the autonomic components will continue. You can inhibit it and slow it down, okay, and eventually it'll stop, but it's not just an off and on process. Okay, let's stop there. I think you guys are swimming in information. I'm going to turn the PowerPoint, we have more to talk about, we're just going to take a break here. Turn this off. And you guys have the advantage of coming second. I always think of better ways of saying things. So my diagram wasn't as large this morning. I don't know if this is more confusing or not, but I did it more as a sequence. I actually think I like that one better, but you're welcome to take a photograph of that. Again, when you're studying this over the weekend, don't try to do the whole thing at one go. Do it sympathetic, parasympathetic, voluntary, look at each pathway separately, and you won't be quite as confused. Okay? I'm not saying you won't be, but it won't be quite as confused. And then we'll review this on Tuesday. Well, why don't you take a break until 2:25, 20 minutes. Give your brain a break. Or actually, parasympathetic. I should have said it. I'm sure.